All right, New Yorkers, ready to dive into the wild world of the city budget.
We're talking about your tax dollars, your neighborhood projects, your city services, all that good stuff.
And we're going straight to the source for this one. No media spin, no watered-down summaries.
We're cracking open the official New York City Council meeting minutes, folks. June 30th, 2024, to be exact, the day the FY 2025 budget was adopted.
I know. Meeting minutes. Doesn't exactly scream edge-of-your-seat excitement.
But trust me on this one, these minutes are important.
What are we talking about here? Secret deals? Hidden agendas?
All of that and more, well, maybe not secret deals, but definitely some interesting voting patterns and power plays. Think of it like a political thriller, but instead of car chases, we've got budget line items.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Set the scene for us. We're in the city council chambers, right?
You got it. Picture this. City Hall, packed chamber. You can practically feel the tension in the air.
Speaker Adams is holding court, I imagine.
Front and center. And surrounding him, a whole cast of characters are esteemed council members, each representing their own little corner of the city.
All present and accounted for.
Well, almost. There were a few interesting absences. Councilmember Vernikov, for one, wasn't present for this particular vote. And depending on their stance, their absence could have actually changed the game that day.
Ooh, the plot thickens. So tell me, was this budget adoption just a formality then? A rubber stamp on a done deal?
Not even close. Let's
Yeah.
just say, if you think budget meetings are all about spreadsheets and quiet whispers, you're in for a wild ride.
I'm ready for it. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, give us a quick rundown of the key players. Who should we be paying attention to?
Well, aside from Speaker Adams, we've got a whole roster of council members, each with their own priorities, their own constituents to answer to.
Right, so every vote tells a story. It's not just about numbers, it's about people, priorities, and how those sometimes clash in the quest for a balanced city budget.
Exactly. And speaking of the budget, before we get completely lost in the drama, let's do a quick overview of what was actually on the table that day.
Yeah, good point. Break it down for us. What exactly were they voting on?
So the council was voting on the FY 2025 budget, which, as you might guess, dictates how the city will spend its money for the entire year. And this isn't just one giant document. It's broken down into four key areas: the expense budget, the revenue budget, the contract budget, and the capital budget. Think of it like this.
Okay, so it's like four budgets in one. Gotcha.
I have to admit, just hearing the words expense budget makes my eyes glaze over a little. Can you break those down a bit more, make them relatable, for someone who maybe hasn't memorized the entire city charter?
Absolutely. Imagine the city's budget as a giant pie chart, right? The expense budget, that's the biggest slice. It covers all the day-to-day costs of running the city. We're talking paying teachers and firefighters, maintaining parks and libraries, keeping the streetlights on. Basically, if it keeps New York City functioning, it's coming out of this budget.
Okay, that makes sense. Where does all that money come from? That's where the revenue budget comes in, right? Bingo. The revenue budget is all about how the city brings in the dough. Property taxes are a big chunk of that, which is why you'll definitely want to stick around for the deep dive on those later. But it also includes things like income taxes, sales taxes, even those pesky parking tickets you try to avoid.
So the revenue budget is how the city keeps the lights on. Literally. What about the other two? The contract and capital budgets.
Right. So the contract budget, that one's all about, well, contracts. Think of things like the company that picks up your trash or the organization that runs your local park. Those contracts are hammered out in this budget.
So there's where the competition comes in. I bet you've got different companies all vying for those contracts, promising to do the best job for the best price.
It's like a bidding war, but instead of that antique vase on Antiques Roadshow, it's basic city services.
Love that analogy. Okay, and then there's the capital budget. What's that all about?
Ah, the capital budget. This is usually where things get really interesting for New Yorkers. This is the budget for big, long-term investments in the city's infrastructure. Think less about keeping the lights on and more about what shiny new lights we're installing.
So new schools, new parks, that sort of thing.
You got it. This is where you'll see funding for building new schools and libraries, renovating parks, developing affordable housing projects. These are the projects that really shape the future of the city, and they often spark the most heated debates among council members.
Makes sense. So much writing on those decisions.
Okay, back to this dramatic budget adoption meeting. You mentioned earlier that things weren't exactly unanimous. Was it just a case of a few council members disagreeing here and there, or was there a bigger pattern emerging? Well, there were definitely some patterns, especially when you look at the votes on those four budgets we just discussed. For example, the executive expense revenue contract budget. Usually that one sails through with little to no opposition.
Because no one wants to be seen as voting against essential city services, right?
Exactly. But this time around, it faced some pushback. Three council members voted against it, Avalis Kaban and Hanif.
Interesting. Now, for those of us who don't have all the council members memorized, what can you tell us about these three? Why might their no votes be significant?
Well, all three are generally considered to be on the more progressive side of the council, often advocating for increased social spending, more robust social safety nets, that sort of thing.
So their dissent on this budget, could it be a statement about their priorities? Maybe they felt like it didn't go far enough in certain areas?
That's a very likely reading. Their votes could definitely reflect concerns about funding allocations for key social programs. Or maybe they weren't happy with some of the revenue-generating measures in the budget. They might have felt those were unfair or inadequate.
It's like a subtle message. Even if it's not a complete shutdown of the entire budget, they're saying, we hear you, but this isn't good enough.
Exactly. It's a nuanced way of expressing dissent and advocating for their constituents. And what makes it even more interesting is that this wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't just about one budget. We actually see a consistent 40-9 voting split on several resolutions throughout these meeting minutes.
Hold on. Oh, 40-9 split. That's pretty consistent. Are we talking about a potential voting block within the council here?
That's exactly what it looks like. And it gets really interesting when you start digging into who voted with whom and on what issues. This 40-9 split, it pops up again and again, especially when it comes to resolutions dealing with property taxes.
Ah, now we're getting to the good stuff. Property taxes in New York City, that's a topic that could start a brawl at a yoga retreat. What's the deal with these resolutions in this voting block? Give me the details.
Well, one piece of legislation in particular seemed to be at the heart of a lot of these votes. Intro 9962. This one, along with several related resolutions, really stirred things up, exposed some fault lines within the council.
Intro, no, 962 sounds ominous. All right, lay it on me. What is this mysterious piece of legislation, and why should every New Yorker renter or homeowner care about it? Intro, no, 962. All right, we're finally getting down to brass tacks. This feels like a turning point in our deep dive. Lay it on me, what is this mysterious piece of legislation, and why should every New Yorker renter or homeowner care about it?
This is the part of the budget that could directly affect how much you pay in rent next year. In a nutshell, Intro No 962 and all those related resolutions that got people so fired up, they're all about how the city collects property taxes and, more importantly, how it uses those taxes to incentivize affordable housing.
Okay, so we're talking about the housing crisis, but through the lens of essentially tax policy, I'm intrigued. But I have to admit, my eyes start to cross a little when we get into the nitty-gritty of tax law. Can you walk us through it, maybe with some real-world examples so it doesn't feel like we're back in civics class?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a landlord in the city, right? You own a building with several apartments.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might be tempted to keep those apartments empty, maybe hoping to sell them later for a big profit, even if it means fewer affordable housing options for New Yorkers.
Which, let's be real, is a big problem in a city where finding an affordable apartment feels like winning the lottery.
Exactly. And that's where Intro No 962 comes in. It essentially gives the city more power to go after landlords who are delinquent on their property taxes, especially those who have a history of neglecting affordable housing units.
So it's a way to hold landlords accountable, make sure those affordable units are actually available to New Yorkers.
That's the idea. The city can use those unpaid taxes as leverage to encourage landlords to maintain and rent out their affordable units. It's a bold move for sure.
And like any bold move, probably drew some strong reactions. Cue that 40-9 split we keep hearing about, right?
You know it. This is where it gets really interesting. It wasn't just a simple case of pro-affordable housing versus anti-affordable housing. The debate was much more nuanced than that. Many of those who voted against Intro No 962, particularly those in that consistent block of 9, they often lean towards what you might call fiscal conservatism. They tend to be more cautious about government intervention in the market, even in cases like this where there's a clear social benefit being addressed.
So a clash of ideologies, but also maybe a reflection of the different priorities each council member brings from their own district.
Exactly. And this clash played out in another significant resolution that day. Resolution No 496. This one set the actual property tax rates for FY 2025. Remember those?
Oh, right. The ones that determine how much of my hard-earned money goes to the city. What were the sticking points
This
there?
is where things get really interesting for homeowners. The resolution didn't set one flat property tax rate for everyone. Instead, it established different rates based on the assessed value of the property.
Right.
So someone with a multi-million-dollar condo in, say, Hudson Yards, they might end up paying a different rate than someone in a more modest home in, say, Southeast Queens.
So the idea is to create a more equitable system where those who can afford to contribute more to the city's budget do so.
Exactly. It's about trying to find that balance between funding essential city services and making sure that people aren't priced out of their own neighborhoods. But as you can imagine, it's a delicate balancing act.
No easy answers when it comes to taxes. Right.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
But that's what makes these meeting minutes so fascinating. They give us this little window into how those sausage-making decisions are made, how different values and priorities come into play, and ultimately how those decisions impact the lives of everyday New Yorkers.
It's like you said at the beginning, a political thriller hiding in plain sight. So for someone listening to all of this, trying to make sense of how it relates to their life, what's the key takeaway here?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these aren't just abstract numbers or dry policy debates happening in some far-off government building. These decisions directly affect your daily life. Everything from the quality of your child's school, to the maintenance of your local park, to, as we've seen, the affordability of housing in your borough.
It's about connecting those dots, right? Seeing the direct link between what happens in those council chambers and the reality of living in New York City.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And realizing that you have a voice in these decisions,
Yeah.
even if it doesn't always feel like it.
So what can listeners do? How can they make their voices heard?
Well, you can start by finding out how your council member voted on these issues. See how the budget impacts your specific district. And most importantly, get involved. Make your voice heard during public hearings and community board meetings.
Yes. And we'll be sure to link to all those resources in the show notes so you can become a budget-savvy New Yorker armed with knowledge and ready to engage in the sometimes daunting civic process.
Because let's be honest, complaining about the MTA is practically a competitive sport in this city. But imagine if we channeled that energy into actually shaping the policies that affect us.
Now that's a New York City I can get behind. Well, folks, that just about wraps up our deep dive into the wild world of the NYC Council budget. We've covered a lot of ground today: property taxes, affordable housing, those fascinating voting blocks.
We've just scratched the surface, really.
Exactly. There's always more to uncover, more to explore. But for now, we want to hear from you. What surprised you most about this deep dive? What questions do you still have about how your city operates?
And maybe, just maybe, we've inspired you to do a little deep dive of your own. Because knowledge is power. Especially when it comes to understanding this incredible, complex, ever-evolving city we call home.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, New Yorkers, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for the city you want to live in.